Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us. On the other end, if you have just joined us, a very big welcome. For those who's been watching the program, you will know that we've been talking about housing crisis in London. We have an expert of panel members here. If you have any questions about housing crisis, please do call into our studio. It's a free line number. The number is 0203 397 4740. That number again for you, it's 0203 397 4740. You may call in, ask any questions, or you may contribute. I know there are a number of people that are trying to call me on my personal mobile. I'm sorry, whilst I'm on air, I can't take personal calls, but please do call the number on the screen. Thank you. Just before we went on break, we were talking to Christopher Worrell, who is the chair of a resident association and also an investment manager. Chris was telling us that given the current situation, the housing prices are cooling off in London. That was the terminology that you used. Can you be a bit more explicit about that and just give us a bit more explanation as to what you mean by that?
So, in terms of house prices, they, as Adam alluded to earlier, they are sort of cooling off a bit in terms of their prices, but the costs are not going any further down. So what that means is we've reached a point in the market where the house prices have exceeded people's borrowing capabilities.
Right.
And as we've seen with the Help to Buy being brought in, requiring large deposits or deposit assistance to help plug that gap. But even with all of those help in that market, the prices are still coming down. And that might be down largely to Brexit uncertainty, but we might see a flight to safety in the sort of prime markets, which have been really soft. They might go up, but the wider boroughs will probably suffer.
Thank you. Can I come back to London again? I've asked Charlotte earlier on about Sadiq Khan's promises to build 65,000 homes per year in London. The supply at this moment in time is about 61,000 per year. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the demand in London for housing per year is about 220,000, which still leaves a deficit of about 170,000 or so, or 60,000. Yeah. Will that gap ever be filled at all, do you think? Or?
So I think that the statistics you quoted are for all properties that have been built, and that's quite right. The demand is, in excess of that. Will it be achievable? I think we can do it. I think with regards to the new models that are looking at for these more institutional affordable housing providers, are looking for partnerships with big house builders. So these are typically guys who would want to build out large 10-acre sites, 5-acre sites, and they look at doing it a third for sale, a third market rent, and a third affordable. What they're able to do with the market rent and the affordable is agree a forward sale of those to another investor.
Yep.
So then they've only got market exposure to the third. So that's something that can unlock it. We've got Barking Riverside, 11,000 units. I mean, they might have had problems with some of the build quality there and sort of ongoing management, but there are councils that are being pragmatic. It's a crying shame that the Haringey development vehicle was binned as a result of ineffective leadership that has come through that council.
But we've heard of good examples in Hackney.
Yeah.
And in some of the other places, Islington as well.
Haringey vehicle, which she rightly points towards, would have been an excellent development. But through elements of bad political management, I think is the best way to put it. Right. Bad political management, it fell down, and now you're actually seeing what's even more perverse is the current administration in Haringey is actually pushing through redevelopments of old estates, and they're not even. There's one example where they aren't even consulting the residents on that estate, which was one of the pledges which the new political administration that came in made, that they wouldn't redevelop estates without giving the residents a say. Right. So I mean, there's because what you've also got is in this system where we're trying to give people homes, is you've also got a mixture of political opinions about how to do that, and lots of competing.
So there are examples of good options out there that if the government is determined that they could adopt?
Well, the best way to do it, and I'll reiterate it and I'll go again, is what the central government has done, is raising the borrowing limit for councils,
Right.
and then giving the councils the ability to compulsory purchase order land. And then what they can do is, rather than the land supply in central London within the M25, rather than that going to the highest bidder, which is what's going on at the moment, and then the financial viability studies which go onto it then go into them building housing developments which have to be profitable in order for them to be viable. What you could have instead is a council becoming a bidding partner, going into it, and then they wouldn't need to have that profit motive.
Sure.
And instead they could build properties 100% for council, or they could build 70% for council, 30% to sell off, and then they could use the profit from that.
Is there any
to recycle
timescale
into
for
the next
that,
scheme.
Adam?
It's in the next, I believe it's in the next 4 years is
4
when
years.
the borrowing cap's being lifted. It's quite a long way away, which means councils now have the ability to ramp up towards it.
Yeah.
So what you can have in Hackney is they can grow their housing department when you have in Tower Hamlets, and what you're going to see is the council invest in having an internal team to look at how they can then best utilise that cheap debt which they'll be able to get to then invest in housing in Tower Hamlets.
Thank you. Right, thanks for that. I'm now going to go to Charlotte, and then I'm going to come to Anjum. What is the solution to London housing crisis, Charlotte? What do you think is the solution?
I mean, I think as we've been talking about tonight, we just need to build more houses. As Adam said, we need to make sure that councils can build, but it's not just about building more houses, it's about where we build them and what we're building.
Yes.
Building these huge luxury apartment blocks in the middle of central London will be probably a great investment for someone, but it's really not going to help. It's a crying shame that on some of the streets where people are sleeping homeless in London, those same streets have giant tower blocks full of luxury apartments. I know New Zealand has brought in laws that limits foreign investment and ownership of housing to try and crack down on that. And I'm not saying that's necessarily what the UK needs to do, but certainly the fact that we've got all these high-rise luxury buildings, but also...
But we've seen that over the course of last 10 years or so, that so many foreign investors have bought these so-called high end of the market homes.
And then they never ever live
They're
in
never
them.
occupied, they're all empty.
So, I mean, New Zealand's law was quite radical. I don't see why the UK couldn't at least consider it. If it was something that we thought it's not feasible for us to do, I don't see why we couldn't. It is just a shame that, as we said, London is so many houses short, whereas actually there are thousands and thousands of flats in London that actually are empty. And I think we also, a lot of people talk about the Greenbelt and their area being really nice, and they want more houses, but they don't want them being built here in this nice area. NIMBYism, I don't want it here, I don't want it there. But also people, a lot of people go around and say the UK is overcrowded and that actually there's no space, but that's completely untrue. Only something like 10% of the UK land is actually built on.
Absolutely, yes.
The UK has swathes and swathes and swathes. Like, of course we need to protect the environment, and all of the building that we do must be sustainable and as carbon neutral as possible. And I'm not saying go out and, just bulldoze the English countryside.
No, of course not.
But what I am saying is there's space for some pragmatism there, working with communities to build in areas where there is land. If you were to go a mile into the green belt around London, I saw a statistic, you could build something like 200,000 homes out there, and that's only going a mile in, which isn't very far out. It would be easily commutable, and you could easily set up communities there. These things could be done.
Thank you, Charlotte. We'll come back to you. Let's go to Azra and Jumna. So what are your thoughts on this? Should we be building within the green belt, do you think, or should we not?
Well, I think one of the solutions in terms of addressing the housing crisis is to obviously build more houses, like other panelists has said. And also, in terms of, I think we need to empower the councils by giving them the, increasing their borrowing
We've
capacity.
heard Adam said about
Yes,
the
Adam said
cap being
that.
lifted or something?
Yes, and also in terms of 30:70 ratio, I think the 70 ratio needs to be looked in. by the government, because we need to have some sort of control in terms of foreign investments coming into our country. Yes,
But isn't that good for the country?
FDIs are good
Yeah.
for the economy.
Yes.
That's fine, and then that works across the world, but not at the expense of our families not having a shelter to live in.
Right. Okay.
So that needs to be looked at. It has to be the other way around, I would say.
Okay. I'll come back to you again. Let me go to Chris again. Chris, being a chair of a resident association, I'm sure you're well aware of the current government discussion on leaseholders reform. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's been good work done by Jim Fitzpatrick, our MP of Poplar and Limehouse, who's sort of been leading on that debate. The work that has been done looks like it could come into legislation in April 2020, so it's a bit of a way away, and he's made a lot of good progress. There's been a lot of unfortunate examples in this borough that have sort of given there's about 47% of Tower Hamlets is leasehold or flats, effectively. Our personal experience as at St Andrews and as the chair is there's been ground rent sold off, which is another key part of the leasehold reform that's been discussed. Mainly but due to house builders selling off houses with rents that double every year. I've had one of my closest friends and his wife had a house sale fall through due to, at the last minute, the purchaser of this house, or the flat, turned around, couldn't get a mortgage anymore because of the very leaseholds that were these onerous conditions. Because with the ground rent doubling every year or 5 years, effectively the amount of rent that you have to pay wipes out the value of the house.
Sure.
But what we've been finding at St Andrews particularly is we've had this ground rent sold off by Barratt, so they will build it out for sale. They'll sell off all the flats and then they'll flog off the ground rent. It's a small charge, £100 or something a year for nothing. And what that does is that goes to the investor. The investor then, they have a small team. They will outsource this out to an asset manager, in our case Mainstay, who will then, again as a small team, managing all these ground rent portfolios, who will then outsource that to a managing agent, so like Pinnacle, who may have been kicked off of the Barking Riverside project development due to their poor management, and they've had horrendous problems over there. A chap called Pete Mason, who's the chair over there, has been sort of leading a big fight against them, and he's in federal legal proceedings. But what's happening and what Pinnacle are doing is they're not keeping conditions with the lease, providing issues on service charge, breakdowns of budgets on service charge. They're not, and what they're doing is they're raising by 20%. This is, we have 1,000 units, £2 million budget. That's a £400,000 increase. You're looking at £400 a household. So we've got no transparency, and we're fighting for formal recognition.
Okay, I mean, look, Pinnacle is not here to defend themselves,
No.
obviously, but I mean,
So,
in terms of the wide scale of the problem, this is what's happening generally. Is that what you're trying to tell us?
yeah, what I'm trying to say is that managing agents are incentivised not to give formal recognitions to resident associations,
Right.
because you would then have a say to the landlord over who is your managing agent.
Yeah.
They're incentivised not to permit you to do that.
Right.
There is legislation that says you need to have 51% of leaseholders signed in your residents association. Our residents association has 536 active members on Facebook. If I need to go door knocking on 1,000 units, and as you were talking about foreign investors who are living in Hong Kong, how am I going to get 51% of those people to say, yeah, please formally recognise me so I can audit those service charge accounts that those people have been raising and putting through costs untransparently in line items that no one can recognise?
Sure.
I'm like, I've got a managing
So
account.
it's a scam then,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, and they're just
Yeah.
doing it for pure profit. And there are some good managing agents.
And
not all bad, don't get me wrong.
they're doing it in such a fashion that it's legal.
Yeah, and it's permitted under the lease. And
So
there's no
hopefully
legal-
when this Reform Act comes out in April 2020 or whenever it's due, that will bring about changes which will prevent these managing agents from...
Well, Jim's been working hard on it, but James Brokenshire, as we've alluded to earlier, he's watering these things down.
Yeah.
Sorry, who's James?
James Brokenshire is the housing minister.
Minister,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah,
Or
part of
they've-
local
they've-
government. and
Local
housing.
government. Right.
They've changed about 10 times.
Yeah.
But in short, just to sort of cut to the
The
chase,
cabinet changes rather quickly,
Yeah.
right?
the residents have no control or say over this, so they're just subject to the costs increasing
Right.
No.
Thank you for that, Chris. Adam, have you got any more thoughts on this?
On
this leaseholder?
on managing agents, there are good ones out there. There really are good ones out there, and I would much rather. This comes back to our point about landlords, road landlords. You've got a lot of people who bought their house, paid off their mortgage, and then maybe remortgaged to go and retire outside of London, and are just sort of one-man bands, as you like, renting out their house. I would much rather have a good managing agent manage my property, who've got a repair team, who've got who I have recourse with, who have elements of transparency. Because I had a really good one at the moment, Field and May on the Isle of Dogs, when I've had my property, and now I'm moving over to a new one, Life Residential. So I'm going to see what another one's like.
Sure. Well, we wish you all the best with that. My last question, and I will come to all four of you because we're running out of time. Housing is such an important issue that affects every one of us, without a doubt. What is the social impact of London's housing crisis on families, children that are living in London and indeed all over the country? Can I start with you, Azra, on that?
Yeah, I think when a child is born, it's a basic human right of every individual and every child who is born to have shelter. And having shelter, food and clothing is the basic right anywhere in the world. And I think a state has the major responsibility to provide this, to ensure that every child who is born on the British soil has a house to live in. Otherwise, these children will end up in social care.
If that basic right is not there, as you put it, it's a basic right that everyone should have. That in itself leads on to a whole load of social problems in the community, doesn't it?
Yes, social, psychological, economical problems, because they are all interlinked. Because having no shelter on your head leads to poverty, then unemployment, then social problems, then family problems, then it pushes families out of their comfort zone, and it also impacts not only children, but it also impacts the teenagers as well. And a lot of children, they come into care because of poor housing or having no house at all.
Thank you. Charlotte, what's your thought? And I know you feel very passionately about this. You said that something like 110,000 children are going to be...
Yeah, that statistic will just always take me aback. Building up on what Azra was saying, as I said earlier, I ran for council in Shadwell, and something that came up again and again and again was housing. Another issue that came up so frequently was antisocial behaviour, and that is inextricably linked to housing, because if a 16-year-old lives in a 2-bedroom flat with his mum, his granny, his aunt, his uncle, he doesn't want to hang out there. The youth centres are being closed down, pushed onto the street, trying all sorts of different things, because teenagers do, because they don't want to be at home. But another social impact that the housing has is not just, say, teenagers that don't want to be at home, but teenagers who don't feel safe in their home. Over a quarter of the homeless population in the UK is LGBT, and that's vastly overrepresented, and particularly people who are trans have serious problems in temporary accommodation. If you're under 30, you can only get government help to rent in a room in a shared house, and if you're an LGBT individual, you're putting yourself possibly at risk again, because unfortunately there is a backlash, and there still exists phobias about this community. So there are young people out there who have been made homeless because they don't feel safe in their home with their parents for unfortunate reasons. And then when they turn to the government for protection, they're not safe either. I mean, trans women aren't... Some female shelters don't allow trans women in, but they obviously don't want to go to a male shelter, and they're left in a really unsafe position, which will obviously impact on mental health.
Mental health as well. Thank you, Charlotte. Adam, your final point on this.
Yeah, so I think that housing is probably the root cause of most of the ills of our society. I do think that having very expensive, very hard to get housing where it creates economic problems which lead to an unsustainable environment for people to live in, which lead to poverty, which leads to crime, which leads to all of the social ills. You know, it's not a.
So if we get the housing issue right, that in itself will
trickle down.
Trickle down.
I hate the term
and
trickle down.
And the other problems that we've got in the society will also come down as well, won't
Yes,
it?
it's not so much a silver bullet. I don't think there's only one solution, but it's one piece of the puzzle, and it's probably the main piece. You give people safe, affordable, decent houses to live in, and they will live a better life.
Thank you. Final point, 30 seconds. Sorry, I've got 30 seconds left, but go on.
You know, it's obviously going to impact social mobility. But you've also got, in the last 5 years, we're now seeing, since 1945, a rise in winter deaths. You know, poor housing, 36,000 have died each year from coldness, and 17,000 from fuel poverty. You know, if we can't get it right on that, then
We're not a modern
we're
society.
going the wrong
That's
direction.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you to all of you for coming along. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching our program. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time with another topic. Keep watching us. Thank you for staying. Good night.